Ecological economists argue that economies should develop the same way most natural things develop. If you think about a human being, they grow for a period, they reach a desirable physical scale, and then they cease to grow. But they don't cease to develop. Economic systems should do the same. They should grow. They need to grow in order to provide the infrastructure, the capital and what have you for people to live decent lives. But once the economy reaches a desirable scale, then you're just producing enough to replace, in a physical sense, what's consumed or what depreciates and wears out over time. But you improve the quality of what you produce. You distribute the stuff more equitably. Politicians or even economists sometimes say, that may be possible in a technical sense, but it's not financially possible for a central government to do that. What modern monetary theory informs us is that, yes, it is.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, Professor Phil Lawn, and in a moment we're going to be talking to him about the Earth's planetary boundaries and how MMT-informed ecological economics can help us plan to live within them. If you're new to MMT, the jumping off point is that currency issuing governments issue currency, and they do that by spending it into existence when they pay for things, and so by definition, governments like these can't run out of their own money. In the show notes for this episode, I've linked to some of our other episodes about the operational details of how governments spend and what that means for the way we think about inflation, and also to our episodes about the job guarantee, which is the MMT policy outlining a better way to fight inflation compared to the way we do it now. Just before we dive in, two quick announcements. Firstly, as you'll hear in a moment, the organisation Professor Lawn has been instrumental in setting up, Modern Money Lab, runs graduate and postgraduate courses in the economics of sustainability that can be accessed from just about anywhere in the world online. And they're hosting live Q&A events for people interested in enrolling. And secondly, for people who are interested in a more introductory level course, Professor Bill Mitchell has mentioned on Twitter that his MMT 101 course will be running again this year from mid-September. There's been no further information since that tweet, so I've linked to where I think updates will be posted in the show notes for this episode, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month, or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live, and no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are honoured to be joined today by one of the world's leading ecological economists and also one of the key researchers behind Modern Money Lab Australia, an institution that's just launched a suite of globally accessible online MMT graduate and postgraduate courses. So it truly is an honour to be joined by Professor Phil Lawn. Thanks for joining us today, Phil.
Thanks for having me.
The great thing about this is that earlier this year, we were talking to Stephen Williams, who co-edited the recently published book, Sustainability of the New Economics, in which you and he co-wrote some chapters. And when we spoke to him, he mentioned that his introduction to MMT was via one of your presentations. And also the person that brought me and Patricia together was one of your colleagues and our friend, Professor Stephen Hale, who was also, as I understand it, introduced to MMT by you. So we get to thank you for being an instigator of good things. So thank you. But who or what introduced you to MMT?
That's a good question. I'm an ecological economist, and ecological economists are particularly concerned with the scale at which we operate the economy. It's not just how we do things, but the physical scale. And we need to ensure that the physical scale is one that can be sustained by a rate of throughput that's within the regenerative and waste assimilative capacities of the natural environment. What that leads to is a conclusion that the economy, in a sense, can't continue to grow in a physical sense. It might be able to improve in a qualitative sense. And one of the sort of assumptions is that economies need to grow at around about 2 or 3% per annum just to prevent unemployment from rising. That was a question that ecological economists have needed to address, and I tried to address to some extent when I wrote my PhD thesis. In doing my research on that particular question, I came across the work of Bill Mitchell and his job guarantee. I see the job guarantee a little bit differently to a lot of MMT economists. I see it not just something that can automatically result in an increase in government spending when private sector spending falls in order to fill that gap to maintain or achieve and maintain full employment. I see it also as a distributive or distributional mechanism, because it may well be that some countries don't have ecological room to grow their economies, and therefore, if those countries are going to achieve full employment without growing their economies, somehow they're going to have to redistribute income. It can be done various ways, and there would be some people who would argue that we should do it via a universal basic income. I would disagree with that. I think it should be done through work, simply because work's critical for most people. A lot of people with mental illnesses are people who've been suffering for a long time with unemployment. So I see the job guarantee as a mechanism that can redistribute income through work. It would probably mean that the very rich would have to pay more tax. That's not to pay for the job guarantee, but that's to provide the ecological space for those at the bottom who are being employed on a job guarantee to be able to access resources without it not only being inflationary, but also not being ecologically unsustainable. So that was the main way I got into MMT. It was through Bill. I think Bill had just formed his Centre for Full Employment and Equity at the University of Newcastle, and I found a number of his working papers and a few of his journal articles, and that's how I came across not just the job guarantee, but I learned about modern monetary theory.
You and I actually met at the MMT conference in New York in 2018, I believe that was the year. One of the things that came out of that conversation was something that you and Stephen Hale are, I believe you two speak about it in a very clear and ambiguous way. You know, this concept, this belief that economies have to grow in real terms indefinitely. It's unsustainable. I don't know if it's that specific message, but maybe other people who are not you and Stephen Hale talking about that aspect of our economies have gone into a more kind of saying capitalism needs GDP growth to exist, therefore we must end capitalism. And when you query them exactly on what they mean, they don't really have a very clear kind of sense. Are we talking about nominal growth? Are we talking about real growth? Perhaps you can explain to me what they mean, or whether you have any issues with the way other people are approaching this particular question.
Yeah, there's a debate about whether or not a capitalist system needs to grow in order to remain viable. The general view is that it does, in a real sense, in a physical sense. I don't believe that's the case at all. It would mean that the form of capitalism that would be required would be very different to the one that most of us are familiar with. The example that I give of the fact that capitalism can exist without growth is, I know we're only talking about an individual business, but my local shopping centre, there's a family-run butcher shop, and they proudly point out that they've been operating for about 70, 80 years and what have you. And I'm pretty certain that the shop hasn't grown physically over that 70, 80-year period. It's probably been passed on over the generations, but that business has been able to generate an income that's been able to provide what's required by the family to live a decent life. They've had to invest because they probably had to update their equipment and what have you, but they've made a profit. So it's not as if they're unable to make a profit, but they only have to make a profit of a particular size in order to operate, and they haven't gone out of business because they failed to grow their business. So I don't see that businesses need to necessarily grow in order to survive in a capitalist system. Of course, another way you can maintain or improve your profits without having to physically grow your business is to improve the quality of what you produce. People generally are willing to pay more for good quality products relative to poor quality products. And if you're able to improve what you produce without having to produce more, that's another way that you can maintain your income, if not grow your income. Other ways that you can increase your income, of course, is that you don't increase your revenue, you reduce your costs, and you might be able to do that by using the resources that are required in order to run your business more efficiently. So you use fewer resources, so therefore your costs decline, your revenue remains the same, and you can in fact enjoy a larger profit. As they are designed at present, to a large extent, there is a degree of truth about the need for capitalist systems to grow, but I think they can be redesigned in a way such that they don't need to grow in order to survive. And then if you think about it, if we're talking about redesigning economic systems so they're sustainable and they're able to provide what we need to live a decent existence, so you've got government providing some of those services, but you'll have businesses providing some of those goods and services. I don't see why they can't make an income. It may not necessarily be a growing income, but it's an income that can be generated that can enable the owners of the business or perhaps even the shareholders to earn a decent income and therefore live a decent life.
There was something interesting earlier you said, Phil. In MMT, we would say, you'd have to raise taxes to free up fiscal space for the government to spend into. And you said something like the rich would probably have to pay more tax to free up, was it biocapacity?
Basically, ecological space, biocapacity. The interesting thing is a lot of modern monetary theorists talk about the fact that for a currency issuing central government, they don't face a financial constraint, they face a real resource constraint. I don't want to sound too insulting to them, but in a lot of cases, they talk about the importance of the real resource constraint, but I sometimes wonder whether they know what that really is. So when we're producing goods and services, we're using human-made capital, that's plant, machinery and equipment. We're using labour, and together those two are used to transform natural resources into final goods and services. It's generally assumed by a lot of modern monetary theory economists that the limiting factor of production is labour. In other words, if you have to use labour, human-made capital together to transform natural resources into final goods and services, they assume that if you were employing them together and increasing your output, eventually you run out of labour. You might have some human-made capital that's idle and you might have some resources that could still be transformed into final goods and services. But at a particular point in time, you can't increase output because you would run out of labour. So assuming that if spending is increased, let's say through central government spending, that full employment can always be achieved just by increasing spending because there's no threat of running out of human-made capital and in particular natural resources to transform if you're using them in a sustainable manner before you run out of labour. And of course the problem is there, if you're trying to use resources, natural resources on a sustainable basis and you run out of the resources that can be transformed into final goods and services and you haven't fully employed everyone who wants paid work, then you are going to have the problem of unemployment, whether you have a job guarantee or not. So therefore, what that means is you need to reorganise things in a way that ensures that labour is always the limiting factor of production. You want to run out of labour first. You don't want to run out of human-made capital to use in combination with labour to produce goods and services. And you don't want to run out of the natural resources that can be used in a sustainable manner. You want to run out of labour first. Because if you run out of labour first, you've achieved full employment. And MMT economists tend to assume that, as I said before, that labour is a limiting factor of production. So there's no real threat of running out of human-made capital and natural resources before you run out of labour. So achieving full employment through, say, a job guarantee or increases in government spending can achieve full employment without this possibility of running out of natural resources or human capital first. Whereas ecological economists see that it's quite possible. Take the United States. The USA has an ecological footprint which is 2.25 times its biocapacity, which means that if it was to overnight reduce its resource use and waste generation to one that's within its biocapacity, it would have to reduce it to 45% of its current level to operate sustainably. That would mean, based on current technology, that the GDP of the USA would fall to 45% of its current level, and you would still you'd have mass unemployment. So you would be running out of the natural resources that you can use on a sustainable basis before you're running out of labour. There's a problem for countries that are operating well beyond their maximum sustainable scale, that already have unemployment. How do you achieve full employment and do it in an ecologically sustainable manner?
I think there is an element of wanting as well to make labour utilisation the priority because of, as you mentioned, the kind of adverse effects that unemployment can have on people, and pushing people into unemployment for the sake of environmental may not seem like a very humane solution. But there's also the difficulty, I guess, that a lot of the environmental constraints that we face are perceived perhaps as long-term as opposed to the immediate constraint of labor. And I fear that there is a tendency to resolve conflicts in between classes simply by producing more in the short term, postponing forever the ultimate reality that we cannot just simply do that to resolve conflicts, but we have to resolve the actual conflict.
Well, at the global level, the global ecological footprint is 1.7 times biocapacity, which means that the rate at which we're using resources and generating waste at the global level, in order for that to be sustained in the long run, we would need 1.7 Earths. And of course, we've only got one Earth. So the global economy is operating well beyond maximum sustainable scale. And it's been doing that for about 50 years. We passed the point where the ecological footprint was equal to biocapacity about 50 years ago. There's no doubt that the rate of throughput, as ecological economists refer, that's the input of resources, output of waste, needs to be reduced. One way you can sort of deal with unemployment, even if you're operating ecologically unsustainably long term, is in the short term just to increase output, and that increases employment. If we're going to solve the sustainability problem, then the only way we're going to be able to do it is through redistribution. And of course, the distribution of income and wealth, the gap between rich and poor has been widening. That has to not only be narrowed, but the very rich are going to have to experience a bit of a haircut, really. And in many cases, a lot of their income is what even mainstream economists would refer to as an economic rent. It's really unearned income. It's a financial claim on real goods and services. It doesn't reflect the contribution that those people are making towards the production of new goods and services, new wealth to replace worn out and depreciated and consumed goods and services. There's going to have to be a redistribution of income and wealth in order for everyone to be able to live a decent life in a world where the rate at which we're using resources and generating waste, in other words, the rate of throughput, is again ecologically sustainable. I think the job guarantee can help in that redistribution process, because if those very wealthy have to experience an income cut through taxation and those at the bottom have to experience an income rise, the best way for those people to enjoy a rise in income is through employment, and that could be done through a job guarantee.
Using the MMT lens, we say that government spending is not revenue constrained. The government is not spending previously collected taxes when it spends, because taxes at the national level primarily drive money from inception. But after that, taxes do function to reduce aggregate demand, and progressive taxation, as you were saying, can therefore be used to even up wealth and income inequality. That said, we never seem to have a target on the high end of wealth. People are very prepared to put quite a specific number on the low end of what they consider to be a socially inclusive minimum wage, but they're reticent to limit the high end. And I just think we won't get to an economically just distribution of wealth if we're not prepared to describe with a number or a ratio how rich is too rich, as in when an individual exceeds this level, they will control a level of wealth that is detrimental to social cohesion and democracy and the environment. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, Phil.
Talking about the country I live in, Australia, I think the most important job would have to be the job of Prime Minister. I think the Prime Minister's salary is about $500,000 a year, and I would argue that no one's worth more than $500,000 a year. If they're earning more than that, they're just enjoying an economic rent. If you tax away the difference between what they're earning and, say, $500,000, you don't have to invoke modern monetary theory or what have you. Just your mainstream economics textbook informs you that if you tax away economic rents, it doesn't distort the supply of resources or labour. So those very rich would just be doing the same things that they're doing now. They wouldn't withdraw their labour because in the case of confiscating economic rent, we know that can be confiscated to the point where the income is reduced to one which reflects what people are worth. And I think that the most of the person's worth is perhaps in Australian dollars terms about $500,000 a year. And if the very rich in Australia don't like that, they can go somewhere else. They can go live somewhere else. And I've heard people say, well, what if they take their money? And I say, even better, because it will reduce their financial claims on real resources and will leave more real resources to the Australians that are left behind. So if the rich want to go somewhere else, fine. I don't think they're the most productive people in the country. I think there's a lot of very productive people who are on only reasonable wages and salaries. So, yeah, I think that there should be a maximum income. I don't think there'd be many Australians who would disagree that the most important job is that of Prime Minister. And if the Prime Minister's on about $500,000 a year, I don't see why anyone should be earning anything more than that.
I think it was Jason Hickel on Twitter a few days ago posited the idea of a ratio. Yeah, I think he was just throwing this out there that in public sector institutions, there's a 5-to-1 ratio. Nobody in the institution can earn more than 5 times the lowest paid person in that institution.
I agree that if you're setting a minimum income, then in a sense you're setting a maximum income as well. So if you're setting a minimum income and then you're saying the maximum can only be 5 times that, then in a sense you're also setting a maximum income.
But then it also kicks it back to people who like to think of themselves as fantastic innovators and job creators, quote unquote, that, okay, well, if you want to make more than that, you're going to have to do something about what's going on the bottom rung now. You have to pull them up. If you want
to. Okay, I see what you mean, yeah.
I think it's not a bad idea. I've only just been turning it over in my mind. I'm sure there's probably some horrendous flaws in it, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, it's a good point because, the minimum income could quite possibly change over time if you use resources more efficiently. In other words, if labour becomes more productive, which means that even maintaining a ratio of 5-to-1, if the minimum can go up, so can the maximum. That would mean using resources more efficiently and improving the quality of what you produce. It wouldn't mean producing each year 2 or 3% more indefinitely, because eventually that's going to be ecologically unsustainable.
Isn't there an element of, I think, politically, just this idea that you're infringing people's freedom to restrict their earnings? And even people who are not millionaires, they imagine that one day they will be millionaires and they don't want to be restricted.
I agree with what those people say, but economic rent is unearned income. So an economic rent is the difference between what a person is paid. If we're talking about labour, it can be a natural resource. And in this country, the wealthiest Australians are miners who earn economic rents, but that's not from their labour, that's the natural resources that they sell. It's the difference between the price that's paid to a factor of production and the minimum required for it to be supplied. I would argue, let's say it's $500,000, then if someone's paid $1 million and you tax away the difference, which is $500,000, that individual will still do what they were doing. They'd still supply their labour. It's only if you go beyond that, tax them beyond that and tax what they are legitimately creating and generating towards the overall stock of real wealth, that you start to distort the supply of labour and other resources. So an economic rent is unearned income. So I don't believe anyone should be enjoying a financial claim on real goods and services for no contribution towards the production and maintenance of real goods and services and real wealth, which is what an economic rent is. So taxing economic rent is not violating that person's right to earn an income that they can legitimately claim reflects the contribution that they're making towards the overall economic pie.
Does this kind of point as well to something else? Because in the environmental movement, and I think they're getting better at this aspect, but for a very long time, there's been this kind of focus on universal solutions, ways that we all can universally change our lifestyles to fix this problem. If we all don't eat meat, if we all recycle, or if we all don't use certain types of products, then everything will be fine. And I feel that part of that has been to avoid the conflict that we were talking about before. Collectively, obviously, we have to change our lifestyles but it's about who needs to change primarily their lifestyles and to what extent, or maybe whose lifestyle should be getting better out of all this. And so sometimes when they say, well, people shouldn't be using cars, so people block roads, or even public transport sometimes, but they don't think about, well, why are some people forced to use these types of transport? So it can gain them more enemies than allies in some instances.
Well, it's important that everyone, in fact, it will be necessary for everyone to do things differently. If we are going to move towards ecological sustainability, then the way people live their lives, the way they consume, the sorts of things that they consume, how much they consume, is going to change. And they'll need to change in a way that reduces the resource intensity of each unit of economic activity, and therefore each unit of physical goods produced and consumed. So that's important. But the point that I made earlier on about ecological economists are also concerned about the overall scale at which that we're operating and the magnitude of production and consumption. So, for example, if over time, through technological progress and changes in people's lifestyle, we were to reduce the resource intensity of economic activity, let's say by 2% per annum, and there is, by the way, a limit to how much you can reduce the resources used to produce and consume a given unit of economic output. But if you were to reduce it by 2% per annum, but the overall scale of goods and services produced each year increased by more than 2% per year, then your demands upon the natural environment, the rate at which you use resources, the rate at which you generate waste would still increase. So if the scale, the physical scale at which we do things increases at a faster rate than we reduce the resource and waste intensity of what we're doing, it still goes up, the overall rate of resource use and waste generation. In fact, that book that you're referring to, that Stephen Williams and Rod Taylor edited, there's the Ecological Economics chapter written by myself and Stephen Williams, where at one point I talk about a fairly well-known formula that was created by a biologist called Paul Ehrlich. It's the IPAT formula. Its impact is equal to population times affluence times technology. I have a little bit of a problem with the equation. I think it should be footprint is equal to population times affluence, which is just GDP per capita times the resource intensity of economic activity. What I found was that if we look at the global level over the last 50, 60 years, the resource intensity of $1 worth of gross world product simply GDP at the global level. So the resource intensity, that is the quantity of resources required to produce $1 worth of gross world product, and this is in real terms, not just in nominal terms, has halved. So technological progress and to some extent changes in the way we consume and produce have led to, over the last 50, 60 years, a halving of the resources required to produce $1 worth of gross world product. However, over that same time, at the global level, per person gross world product has doubled. So they cancel each other out. So the reason why the ecological footprint has doubled in the last 50, 60 years is because global population has doubled over the last 50, 60 years, which of course any mention of population tends to be quite controversial. So population is one of the driving forces behind the increase in the scale of economic activity. So we've done very well, really, through technological progress and so forth to reduce the resource intensity of $1 worth of gross world product. So if per person gross world product had remained unchanged over the last 50, 60 years, and the world's population of human beings had have remained as it was 50, 60 years ago, then total resource use and waste generation, and that would include things like greenhouse gas emissions, would be half what they are today. So you can see that the fact that they've been going up rather than been going down despite the technological progress is because the scale at which we're doing things has increased, and that's due to the increase in the per capita rate of production and consumption and population. So if you multiply the two together, effectively you're talking about gross world product has more than doubled. It's increased by a factor of 4. We've halved the resources required to produce $1 worth of gross world product. We've doubled, therefore, the ecological footprint at the global level.
You touched on it a minute ago that the conversation about world population growth is controversial. And let's just get headlong into that. How should we think about it? And I'm looking here to reassure people who worry that as soon as the conversation turns to the world's got too many people in it, it very quickly turns the corner into eugenics and the global north lecturing the global south, or you guys are having too many babies, and there's some ugly characters in that conversation.
I always start off by saying, look, we need to do something about population from an ecological perspective. How we do it, well, it needs to be done in a way that's fair, just and equitable, and humanely, of course. I don't like to single countries out or people of a particular ethnicity out. We were talking before about what's the maximum income that a person should have, say, in a country like Australia, perhaps $500,000 per year. I don't think a country should have any more than 100 million people. So if I say that, I'm not just talking about China and India. I'd be talking about the USA, and I'd be talking about Russia, and I'd be talking about people across many religions and ethnicities. Something needs to be done about population, and it's not always recognised the importance of it. You might have heard of these 9 planetary boundaries and the fact that at the global level we've surpassed 4 of those planetary boundaries. And when it's individual countries are looked upon and how they're performing with respect to their own boundaries, this particular organisation has argued that only recently has India exceeded its climate change boundary. And it's said that because only recently has India's per capita CO2 emissions passed the per capita global rate of CO2 emissions. But I would argue that that's not sufficient to look at things in those terms, because India happens to be at present the 3rd largest generator and emitter of CO2 on Earth. And that can only be put down to one factor, and that's its population. So I don't want to sound too critical of countries like India, because I would be very critical of a country like Australia, which only has 25 million, in that its per capita rate of resource use and waste generation is far too high. So Australians might be able to lecture Americans with 330 million people, and say Indians and the Chinese and so forth about their population, but I think Indians could lecture Australians about their ridiculously high per capita rate of resource use and waste generation. So it's important to get both down, population and per capita rates of resource use and waste generation. In the case of population, well, we're talking about high populated countries. It's not a focus on particular type of people. It's just overpopulation as a whole. But it's also a criticism of countries that clearly have a per capita rate of resource consumption and waste generation that's far too high. There's scarcely a country on earth that couldn't be criticised in one way, shape or form, whether it's their population or their per capita rate of throughput, which when magnified to the global level is ecologically unsustainable.
I think it's important to point out perhaps the causes behind the population growth. And if we look at the developing countries in general, birth rates used to be a lot higher in those countries, say 50 years ago than they are today. I believe just Googling. So World Bank source, it says in the 1960s, there were 6 births per woman in India, whereas today there are 2.2 births per woman. Comparatively in Europe, I believe is about 1.5 births per woman. So Europe technically is shrinking in terms of birth rates. But I think the other factor pushing population growth is, of course, that we're living longer. But I don't know to what extent I'm willing to say, okay, well, we should be living less and we should be trying to let people go earlier. Yeah, I think that's a difficult one.
So much for steering away from controversy here.
Yeah, I know.
Have you seen Logan's Run?
Yes, I would have gone long ago.
The point is that, things are stabilizing and too slow perhaps for what we need them to do. But we've come a long way in terms of birth rate.
There's a message in that Logan's Run. I don't know how many people who will be listening to this will know about the movie, but I think you can only live to age 29. Was that right?
Yeah, it sounds about right.
There is a message there because it's not as if it was considered, it's a long time since I saw that movie, that it was undesirable for someone to be older than 29. I think, was it for ecological or something like that, overpopulation reasons, that it was seen as a necessity. But we're now seeing, not just with population, we're seeing also with climate change policy, a great problem that we're now facing because we failed to deal with these issues in decades past. What you learn when you learn a little bit about demography is that even when the birth rate is equal to replacement rate, it can take 3 or 4 generations before the population, if it has been growing, reaches the point where it no longer grows, where you've got a steady population, steady state population. And that's because if you've got a lot of people at the low age quintiles and they move up into, because you've had high birth rates in the past, I don't know if you've seen it, it looks a bit like a pine tree. So you've got the 90 to 100 age cohort, there's only a small number, and you've got males, females, and it sort of comes down to the younger ones. And then what you find is that sort of moves up. And in fact, the tree doesn't necessarily get taller, but it gets broader as your population grows. And that as those down the bottom move up, as long as they are replacing themselves, you end up with something that looks like a skyscraper. It's just that it's a very wide skyscraper instead of a very narrow one. So the problem we face now is that we've failed to do anything about population growth in the past, that even as we move towards birth rates where the birth rate involves just replacement of those people who are dying, that the population is likely to continue to increase, global population, for some time. And I think now the World Health Organization or what have you doesn't think that the population of human beings will level out until we reach about 11 billion, 12 billion. But it was only about 3 or 4 decades ago, it was going to be 9 billion. Well, early next year, the total number of people on Earth will pass the 8 billion mark. I was born in 1964. I'm no longer a spring chicken, but I'm not old. I've only been on this earth for a relatively short time, but the year in which I was born, the number of people on earth was 3.6 billion. So in my lifetime, it's gone from 3.6 billion to, well, early next year, 8 billion. And that is something that we really needed to deal with, and we haven't. You mentioned, Patricia, about the fact that, as people get wealthier, the fertility rate tends to decline, and it does.
Education of women, I believe, has the most.
Education of women, yes. In fact, that's probably in many ways more important, because one of the problems with relying upon what's called the demographic transition, where you wait for people to get richer in order for the fertility rate to fall, is because, as I mentioned before, one of the driving forces of ecological destruction is increasing affluence. So what you're doing is you're relying upon something that's destroying the natural environment to deal with something that's going to lessen the environmental impact. So
just to make things more complicated.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that area. There's no doubt that when Paul Ehrlich referred to, it was the title of his book in 1968, The Population Bomb, that bomb is still ticking away.
Isn't the problem with this conversation, I don't mean this literal conversation that we're having, but the conversation about population growth, is there are a number of factors that are feeding into the Earth's population blowing past the Earth's biocapacity. And there's a number of things that we can change to address that. As you were talking about earlier, Phil, reducing the resource intensity of production is one of those levers that we can always be working on. Focusing on population, there's no way it doesn't degenerate into, right, you people are going to have to stop having kids. Right. And you people are living too long. And it's like, well, okay, what's the solution there? You're saying, right, sterilization here, Logan's Run there. Why don't we concentrate on something that we can actually fix with the people we've got, which is resource intensity, for instance?
Therein lies the problem. I mentioned before that we've halved globally the resource intensity of $1 worth of gross world product in the last 50, 60 years. We've doubled the per person gross world product. So those two cancel each other out. The ecological footprint of the planet has doubled because the population of the Earth has doubled. So had population remained as it was 50, 60 years ago, we could have enjoyed a doubling of gross world product and not had any increased impact upon the natural environment. In fact, 50, 60 years ago, the ecological footprint of the planet was within global biocapacity. So the global economy was at a scale that was ecologically sustainable. So we could have doubled per person gross world product as we did, and we could have remained ecologically sustainable because we overcame that ecological impact by halving the resource intensity or the throughput intensity of $1 worth of gross world product, but we've doubled the ecological footprint because we did nothing about population.
We have to deal with time only moves in one direction. So, we can't go, oh, if only we'd done something back then. And but we didn't, and we're here now. I'm just trying to get us away from what are we going to do? Are we going to just send out a global police force and say how long people are going to live? It's like, what are we going to do?
Well, the more we put these things off, the more that's likely.
Yeah, okay, yeah, all right.
I can see the day where, for example, recalcitrant nations, when it comes to climate change, which continue to use coal to generate electricity, are going to have jets coming over and bombing those coal-fired power stations. I don't want to see that, but you can see, because we failed to deal with these issues in the past, I'm not saying that means that we have to do horrible things, but that makes them more likely, and it makes it more difficult to solve the problems that we face. I think you mentioned before how a lot of people see it as just changing the way we do things, making sure we properly separate our garbage when we put it out, will solve our ecological problems. That's important, but it's led to complacency. So I still hear people tell me that if we move towards net zero emissions, we can prevent the rise in average global temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees. Well, if you read some of the stuff that's coming out on climate change, you can forget about 1.5 degrees and you can probably forget about 2 degrees. So the Paris Agreement has a preamble which says that countries of the world are committing themselves to preventing temperatures going up by more than 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. But the country's targets, when you put them into a model, puts us on track for 2.7 degrees temperature rise. India doesn't plan to move towards net zero emissions until 2070, and it's the third largest generator and emitter of CO2 on Earth. Again, I don't want to single out Australia. Its per capita emissions continue to rise too. Its overall contribution at a global level is a lot smaller because there's a smaller population. But that doesn't excuse Australia for the fact that its per person CO2 emissions are many times more than it is of the average Indian, and Australia needs to be criticised for that as well. So I guess in what I've been trying to say, I'd like to think that it should be clear to people that what we need to do is very urgent. We don't have much time, and it may restrict some of the things that we take for granted today. And that is the result of us failing to make or accept some minor restrictions in the past.
So just turning the corner, MMT is all about understanding money as a system, how it works, but that's just the beginning. And you need to know how it works. But in order to form policy, you have to know what you want the system to do. And so tell us about the idea of a steady state economy. What is it? How might we get there?
Well, so a steady state economy is a non-growing economy. And so ecological economists argue that economies should develop the same way most natural things develop. If you think about a human being, they grow for a period, they reach a desirable physical scale, and then they cease to grow. But they don't cease to develop. Just because you stop growing when you're in your late teens or around 20 years of age or what have you, doesn't mean that you stop developing as a human being. Economic systems should do the same. They should grow. They need to grow in order to provide the infrastructure, the capital and what have you for people to live decent lives, to be able to thrive. But once the economy reaches a desirable scale, then production simply equals consumption. So you're just producing enough to replace, in a physical sense, what's consumed or what depreciates and wears out over time. But you improve the quality of what you produce, you distribute the stuff more equitably, and design the economic system in such a way that you ensure that those at the very bottom enjoy an income that allows them to live a decent existence, that perhaps you have to put a limit on those at the very top, given that we all need to fit within that ecological limit. And we have something like a job guarantee to ensure that the income that's distributed is distributed in a way that guarantees full employment, so that we don't have people who may have a basic income, but they're suffering from a mental illness because they don't feel like they're making any sort of valuable contribution towards society because they're unemployed. Work does have value in itself. And of course, work produces goods, and that's needed so that the income being earned by the people who are on the job guarantee isn't being spent on goods that don't exist, which can be inflation. One of the problems with the universal basic income, which a lot of UBI people don't understand, is the potential hyperinflationary effect of it. It would be hyperinflationary because if everyone was paid a basic income to start with, then you would have a lot of people exiting the labour force, which would mean you'd have more money to spend, fewer goods produced, and that would be hyperinflationary. What you have with the job guarantee is that basic income, if someone is not currently enjoying it because they're unemployed, they receive one. So not everyone receives. So it's not universal, but it's a minimum income all the same. But those people take on job guarantee jobs. They're going to be producing stuff, even if it's not stuff that's sold within the private sector. It's at least stuff that's being provided in the public sector. So the overall income of everyone is matching the value of the goods and services produced. So it's not hyperinflationary.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. And another thing that I think gets missed, and you touched on it earlier about you want to run out of labor before you run out of resources, is the power of the job guarantee to redefine what the standard job is. So if you're worried about if everybody who's currently unemployed gets a job and starts producing stuff, that's going to put a lot of pressure on our biocapacity and our systems. So unemployment is desirable. You could say, well, hang on, what happens if the job guarantee pays a socially inclusive wage for a 20-hour work week? Now every other employer in the economy has to provide something like that at a minimum, and all of a sudden we're working less. There would be problems that need to be addressed if we did it that dramatically, perhaps.
Well, it'd be inflationary because, in a sense, you've got a withdrawal of labour. So, in a sense, that's equivalent to people working full-time hours over a week and getting twice the minimum income in terms of the potential inflationary effect of the income that they might be spending on goods and services.
I'm using that extreme example just to sort of, there's a way to incrementally move it down, I guess.
Well, you could do that. If we don't want to produce and consume more and we're able to reduce the resource intensity of economic activity, then in a sense, you'd be providing the same income for the same quantity of goods and services produced, but it would just require half as much labour time to produce them. So you'd be increasing the real wage, and that could be done either by maintaining the minimum income at a certain level, so to speak, and reducing work time, or if you still have the job guarantee at, say, 35 to 40 hours a week, you could increase the minimum income. You can do it either way, or a bit of both.
Yeah.
We face a lot of very difficult choices. The human race has made things very difficult for itself because our failure to deal with a lot of the ecological issues and just the sheer physical scale at which we're operating, which is ecologically unsustainable. I guess the one consolation, of course, is that if something is possible, what modern monetary theory informs us is that if the private sector is not willing to do it, there's nothing stopping from a financial perspective for the central government, if it's a monetary sovereign, to do it. And that includes putting someone who's looking for work who can't find work to work. I think the key message from modern monetary theory is that you sometimes hear politicians or even economists or non-economists say, that may be possible in a technical sense, but it's not financially possible for a central government to do that. What modern monetary theory informs us is that, yes, it is. If something's possible technically, then there's really nothing stopping us from doing it. But the great problem that we have is that maintaining the level of gross world product for the number of people that currently live on Earth, and it's going to increase for some time yet, is the thing that we have to deal with as much as dealing with things like unemployment and the distribution of income. We've got to find a way to lower our ecological footprint at the global level so it's back within the biocapacity of the planet. I was mentioning before about these 9 planetary boundaries, and one of them is in the area of climate change. Now, even though the Paris Agreement really isn't up to scratch, it is a global agreement on one of the planetary boundaries. And I think we need to have 9 of those agreements dealing with all 9 planetary boundaries so that all the countries of the world are aiming towards operating within planetary boundaries. So that would mean we'd be aiming to lower the global ecological footprint within biocapacity. And then it would be, if we do that, how do we do it in a way where we don't leave people behind, don't have people starving? And it will require more than anything else a redistribution of income and wealth globally and within countries, of which things like the job guarantee, I think, within countries will play an important part.
I'm glad you mentioned the kind of global redistribution of wealth aspect as well, because obviously a lot of focus on, for example, Chinese use of coal and India's exports, things like that. But, we are the ones buying those things. The global north, say, does extract a lot of resources from the global south. So it doesn't seem fair to simply say, well, it's your problem.
Getting to these solutions, obviously, we've called ourselves the MMT podcast because we think that once the MMT view of money as a system becomes common sense and replaces the household analogy for government spending, we get to have these conversations about, as you say, Phil, what's possible rather than the household analogy, which is, oh, well, we're just broke. Well, we'd love to fix that, but we can't. And so I would say Modern Money Lab is an effort from your end to further that narrative and marry it to ecological economics. But tell us some more about how it came about and what kind of work you're doing there.
Modern Money Lab is designing these postgraduate courses. There's 3 of them. There's a graduate certificate, there's a graduate diploma and a master's. These are online courses that are being offered at the global level, so you can be anywhere in the world and do these courses. The teaching begins next month. Steve and Hale will be teaching the first 2 subjects that we'll be offering, but as we move into next year, so it's done on a trimester basis. There's 2 foundation subjects which are offered every trimester, and then there's various other subjects. So you learn a bit about modern monetary theory and so forth. Then some of the other subjects that are being offered, you learn about the different schools of thought, which is important to know the schools of thought, which, well, we think could be described as mythical economics. So you need to know that. I think it was Joan Robinson who once said that the best reason for learning economics is so you don't get fooled by economists. So you need to know the garbage and in order to argue against it and why it's garbage. One of the subjects I'll be teaching is sustainable development indicators. So I don't know if you're familiar with the genuine progress indicator.
Yes, I know there's lots to say about the GPI, but I was going to throw this out there because you are the expert. Wikipedia have a sort of headline definition or a way to think about GPI, and I just wondered whether you agreed with it or how you'd critique it. On Wikipedia, they've written, comparatively speaking, the relationship between GDP and GPI is analogous to the relationship between the gross profit of a company and the net profit. The net profit is the gross profit minus the costs incurred, while the GPI is the GDP minus the environmental and social costs.
No, that's not right. Yeah,
okay,
not.
Great, good,
yeah.
Good. Tell. I'm glad we were talking to the expert. Tell us how wrong that is.
There's nothing wrong with GDP if, as a measure, a monetary measure of the total volume of economic activity. In other words, as a monetary measure of the quantity of final goods and services produced within a particular country. If that's what you want, go no further than the GDP. But, of course, GDP just tells you about the volume of economic activity. It doesn't tell you whether that's desirable, at what cost it's coming at, whether it's welfare increasing or welfare maintaining. So an increasing percentage of GDP is defensive and rehabilitative, which is not increasing our well-being. It's just dealing with the past errors, particularly ecological problems. So, for example, it could be a day where the Netherlands will be a very large percentage of its GDP will simply be used to raise the dike walls because of sea level rise, which won't be increasing their well-being. It will just be maintaining it, but it'll be coming at a huge resource cost. So it's coming at a cost without additional benefit. GDP goes up, but the genuine progress indicator measures the benefits of economic. People find this quite extraordinary, that you'd think that having a macroeconomic indicator that measures the major benefits of economic activity and the major costs, and when I'm talking about benefits and costs, I'm not just talking about economic benefits and costs, but also social and environmental benefits and costs. So you measure all the benefits, you measure all the costs, you subtract the costs from the benefits, and you get a measure of net benefit. Most people think, well, that seems quite logical. Surely there's a formal indicator like that being calculated by all the national statistical agencies of the world, of each country, and there isn't. There's no such thing. There's just a thing called GDP, which, as I said, is a good measure, monetary measure of the volume of economic activity, but it doesn't tell you whether that, as I said before, whether that's beneficial, whether it's been equitably distributed, and so forth. So the GPI is an indicator that measures the benefits and costs of economic activity. It takes into account also the distribution of income and wealth, so that if consumption goes up, but the distribution of income moves more towards the rich and away from the poor, then the welfare contribution of that consumption falls. And that's because, without trying to sound too technical, the marginal benefits of consumption for a rich person are less than they are for a poor person. Try and imagine the wealthiest Australian, very wealthy, experiencing a weekly increase in income of $100, and they spend it on consumption goods. That would scarcely provide additional benefits to that individual. But imagine if the poorest Australian experienced a $100 increase in income and therefore consumption would have a massive increase in their well-being. So simply taking $100 away from the richest Australian, giving it to the poorest person, I would argue it's best done through work if the person's unemployed, would have virtually no negative impact on the well-being of the richest person, but would have a significant beneficial impact on the poorest person. So without increasing income, without increasing GDP, and therefore without increasing consumption, you can increase the welfare of a nation. So there's an adjustment for the welfare contribution of consumption in line with changes in the distribution of income. There's some of the cost factors. They're not just environmental costs, they're also social costs, such as the cost of labour underutilisation. So it's not just unemployment, but underemployment. There's crime, there's family breakdown, which is usually, well, often the result of an inequitable economic system, and unemployment. So some reinforce each other. There's, of course, the benefits. So some of the benefits, apart from private consumption benefits, they're the benefits of the public goods provided by government. There's a lot of criticism towards the GPI. Some people think it's loaded with costs, but in fact, it includes a benefit that the GDP doesn't. And it includes all non-paid work. So all non-paid work within the household or within the informal economy is included in the GPI, and it's not included in the GDP. And that's important because I did a sort of back of the envelope calculation. I've sort of worked out that about 25 to 30% of the increase in Australia's GDP over the last 50 to 60 years is due to nothing more than economic activity shifting from the informal segment of the economy to the formal segment of the economy. That doesn't constitute an increase in economic activity. It's just an increase in economic activity that's captured by national accounts. Whereas if economic activity shifts from the informal economy, which is included in the GPI, and moves to the formal economy, there's no change in the GPI, but the GDP increases. So it gives the false impression that we're better off when in fact there's a bit of a joke about GDP and the ways in which you can increase GDP. And one way you can do that is that you can have a married couple where, let's say, the wife is the one who goes to work, does paid work as a high salary, and let's say the man is the one who stays at home and does the housework. They can get divorced and the house husband stays in the house, so he doesn't get kicked out of the house. He does the same housework, and the ex-wife pays the ex-husband for the housework that was previously done for nothing. The GDP rises, but there's no increase in economic activity. There's no change in the GPI.
Also, GDP goes through the roof because of the divorce lawyers as well.
Yeah, that's true too. Some medical and some legal costs and so forth are considered defensive or rehabilitative. They're subtracted from the GPI. Well, not so much subtracted, they're not counted as benefits.
Just looking at the GPI versus GDP graphs online, it's really interesting to see as well how they've been back calculated down to the 50s and just to see what's actually happened in the last 70 years or so. I have in front of me some global GDP versus GPI, US GDP versus GPI, and then UK GDP versus GPI. I couldn't find an Australia one, sorry. But what's interesting about this is that up until about the 70s, you get GDP and GPI calculations pretty much parallel to each other, which is, I mean, what happened in the 70s?
That's a good, well, yeah, unemployment in the Western world became a thing that hadn't been something in the past. And it was about the early 1970s that the ecological footprint of most countries began to exceed the biocapacity of those countries. So the ecological costs were going up quite rapidly. So social costs went up. And of course, that's around that time where in the post-World War II period, for most Western countries, the distribution of income, in fact, became more equal. Full employment or something close to it was the norm. And of course, with the 1970s stagflation, unemployment became an issue and the distribution of income became more unequal. So it's not so much that benefits didn't go up post sort of early 1970s. It was that a lot of costs started to go up at a faster rate. So ecological economists talk about the difference between economic growth and uneconomic growth. So where the GDP and the GPI go up together, that would be an example of growth being economic. And economic growth is growth that increases benefits more than it increases costs. So net benefits rise, so the GPI rises. Post-1970, early 1970s, that's where growth has become uneconomic. That's where the increase in benefits from growth is being exceeded by the increase in costs. So net benefits are falling and the GPI is declining. So whilst GDP has continued to go up, that hasn't necessarily made us better off. In fact, in some cases, for a lot of people, it may have made people worse off.
Precisely that. So in the global graph after the 70s, you have stagnation of the GPI or even a slightly decrease in GPI. So we're worse off than we were in the 70s at a global level. The US, the same story, is stagnant. And the UK, it was a dramatic drop in the 90s. And now, well, there's a slight increase, but overall, largely same levels as 1970s. So nobody's actually living better lives than they were in 1970s.
No, that's right. So for all this extra growth, environmental damage, we really haven't made people's lives any better. Now, ecological economists think the GPI is useful for a number of reasons. And one of them is around that time that the GPI started to sort of level off or decline when GDP continued to rise is where ecological economists believe you should stabilise the economy at a steady physical state. It's around that time we should have made the transition to a steady state economy. We should have focused on improving the distribution of income. It was much more even then, but it could have been improved further, continuing to maintain full employment or something close to it, and just focusing on improving the quality of what we produce rather than increase the quantity, because GDP doesn't really measure quality but does measure quantity. And so we could have increased the GPI. So what we could have done was the GPI could have gone up with the GDP to about the early 1970s. The GDP could have leveled off and we could have done things better, improved the quality of what we did, tried to achieve full employment with something like a job guarantee and so forth. And so the GPI could have continued to rise with a flattening GDP. That's what ecological economists think we should have done in the early 1970s.
Thanks so much for your time, Phil. It's been great. Before we sign off, we've talked about a lot of things. What would you say is the single most urgent and actionable thing a person could do after hearing this? Or what would you like to underscore from everything we've talked about?
It's important that everyone tries to do as much as they can to lighten their environmental impact, perhaps confine their spending on quality things and not just buy something for the sake of buying it. Learn some modern monetary theory and ecological economics, because it's not until people are familiar with this and they're comfortable with the idea that if a central government, in order to achieve the things that it has to achieve, has to continuously run a budget deficit, that's not a problem. And in fact, that means a private sector surplus. I often give talks and I ask people, would they like the private sector to be running surpluses? And they say yes. And I say, would you like the central government to be running a surplus? And they say yes. And I said, well, you can't have both. Only one can run the surplus. And only one can continue to run the deficit in a financial sense, and that's the central government. So who would you rather run the deficit? And of course, it's only then that they sort of get some sort of idea that, yes, it is the government that needs to run the deficit, not just if it's necessary to maintain full employment to ensure we're doing the right sort of things to move towards a sustainable economy, but it's required to maintain stability of the financial system, because the financial system used to be in the Western world fairly stable in the post that 30-year period after World War II, because governments generally ran deficits, and it meant that the private sector was running surpluses. So if there was any shock to the economy, the private sector always had savings to draw upon. And so any sort of recession was very short, it was very shallow, and so unemployment went up a bit, but then quite quickly you move back to full employment. That's not the case now. A lot of consumption spending is now financed by borrowing because of inadequate net spending of central governments has drained a lot of the savings of the private sector, which means that if there is a shock to the economy, there's very little that the private sector can do other than borrow more. Well, if the reason for the shock to the system is because the private sector can't borrow more, it's had to stop spending in order to repay its debts, then the economy is far more vulnerable, particularly more vulnerable when you have people running central governments who think that a government budget surplus is a good thing and a deficit's a bad thing.
Thank you, Phil. It's been an amazing talk.
You've been so generous with your time, Phil. We've been speaking with Professor Phil Lorne. ecological economist and one of the key researchers behind Modern Money Lab's graduate and postgraduate courses in the economics of sustainability. And we'll link to where you can find out more about those courses in the show notes for this episode. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Professor Phil Lawn.
Thanks for having me.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you. You've been so generous with your time, Phil, and I've really enjoyed.
Well, I'd probably be watching something ridiculous on television.